When billionaire Graham Kensington offers shelter to homeless Zora Williams during a snowstorm, he never expects his act of kindness to change his life. As their worlds collide, can two people from completely different backgrounds overcome their pasts, family expectations, and a dangerous ex to discover that sometimes the most unexpected connections become the most unbreakable? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The winter wind howled through the streets of Manhattan, carrying snowflakes that stung like tiny needles against exposed skin. Graham Kensington stood at the window of his corner office on the 52nd floor, watching the city lights blur through the snowstorm. At 45, he had everything money could buy. A penthouse apartment, a fleet of luxury cars, and Kensington Enterprises, the real estate development company his grandfather had started, and he had transformed into a billion-dollar empire. Yet something was missing. The same emptiness that had followed him for years seemed to grow deeper with each passing day. "Mr. Kensington?" His assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Your car is waiting downstairs." Graham sighed, turning away from the window. "Thank you, Diane. I'm heading down now." He gathered his coat and briefcase, taking one last look at the stack of contracts on his desk. Another day, another deal. The routine was as predictable as it was profitable. The elevator descended smoothly, and Graham checked his watch. 8:30 p.m. Another late night at the office. Not that it mattered. No one was waiting for him at home. When the doors opened to the lobby, he nodded at the night security guard and pushed through the revolving doors into the bitter cold. The wind nearly knocked him back, and he pulled his cashmere coat tighter around himself. That's when he saw her. A woman huddled in the corner of the building's entrance, trying to shield herself from the wind. She wore a thin jacket that was clearly no match for the February weather. Her hands, red and chapped, clutched a small backpack. Graham usually walked past the homeless people of New York without a second glance. He made generous donations to shelters, which was, in his mind, the proper way to handle the city's poverty problem. But something about this woman made him stop. Perhaps it was the way she held herself, head up, shoulders straight, despite her obvious distress. She wasn't begging or asking for help. She was simply trying to survive. "Miss," Graham found himself saying, "are you all right?" The woman looked up, and Graham was struck by her eyes, deep brown and filled with a quiet dignity that took him by surprise. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice hoarse but firm. "Just resting a minute." "In this weather?" Graham glanced at the snow swirling around them. "Do you have somewhere to go?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face before she masked it. Of course, it was an obvious lie, but Graham admired her pride. "Listen," he said, surprising himself. "There's a coffee shop around the corner. Still open. Why don't you let me buy you something warm to drink?" She eyed him suspiciously. "Why would you do that?" A fair question. Graham wasn't sure of the answer himself. "Because it's freezing out here, and no one should be in this weather without somewhere warm to go." After a long moment, she nodded and slowly stood. Graham noticed she winced slightly, as if in pain. The coffee shop was nearly empty when they entered. The warmth enveloped them immediately, and Graham saw the woman's shoulders relax slightly. "Pick." "Whatever you want," he said, gesturing to the menu board. "Just plain coffee is fine," she said. "And to eat?" She hesitated. "I'm not hungry." But Graham had seen the way her eyes lingered on the display case of sandwiches. "2 coffees and 2 turkey sandwiches," he told the barista, ignoring the woman's protest. They sat at a corner table, and for the first time, Graham really looked at her. Despite her disheveled appearance, there was something striking about her. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and though her clothes were worn, they were clean. She wasn't what he had expected. "I'm Graham Kensington," he said, extending his hand. She hesitated before taking it. "Zora Williams." "Nice to meet you, Zora. Do you mind if I ask what you're doing out in a snowstorm?" Zora wrapped her hands around the coffee cup, soaking in the warmth. "It's a long story. I've got time." She took a small bite of her sandwich, chewing slowly as if savoring every morsel. "I lost my apartment last week. The building was sold to developers. They're turning it into luxury. Condos." The irony wasn't lost on Graham. His company had done exactly the same thing to countless buildings across the city. "I had a place lined up to stay tonight, but it fell through, Zora continued. The shelters are all full because of the storm. I was just trying to stay warm until morning. You have a job? Graham asked. I did. I was a home health aide for an elderly woman, but she passed away last month and I haven't found anything new yet. She looked him in the eye. I'm not looking for charity, Mr. Kensington. Once the storm passes, I'll be fine. Graham wasn't sure why, but he didn't want this conversation to end. Where's your family? A shadow crossed Zora's face. Not in the picture. Something about her quiet resilience moved Graham in a way he couldn't explain. He had met countless people in his life, business partners, socialites, politicians, but few had made such an immediate impression on him. I have a proposition for you, he said suddenly. I own a building not far from here. There's a vacant apartment, just renovated. You can stay there until you get back on your feet. Zora's eyes widened. Why would you offer that to a complete stranger? Graham wasn't sure himself. It was completely out of character for him. Consider it a loan. When you find work, you can pay rent. Until then, it's better than being on the street. Zora studied him, suspicion clear in her eyes. What's the catch? No catch. The apartment is empty anyway. People don't just help others for no reason, especially in this city. Graham leaned back in his chair. Maybe I'm not most people. Zora almost smiled at that. Oh, I think you probably are, but right now, I don't have many options. She straightened her shoulders. I accept your offer, Mr. Kensington, but I want to be clear. This is temporary and I will pay you back. Graham nodded, surprised by the strange feeling of satisfaction her acceptance gave him. Deal. 30 minutes later, they entered a well-maintained building in Chelsea. The doorman raised his eyebrows at Zora's appearance, but said nothing when Graham greeted him by name. The apartment was on the 3rd floor, small by Graham's standards, but nicely furnished with the basics. Zora stood in the entryway, clutching her backpack, looking overwhelmed. It's just temporary, she said, almost to herself. The kitchen is stocked with some basics, Graham told her, opening a cabinet to show her. Bathrooms through there, bedrooms got clean sheets. Zora walked slowly around the space, touching things as if to confirm they were real. Why are you really doing this? She asked again. Graham considered the question. I'm not sure, he answered. Honestly, but you needed help and I'm in a position to give it. She nodded, accepting his answer for now. Thank you. There's a phone in the kitchen. My number is programmed in it if you need anything. As Graham turned to leave, Zora called after him. Mr. Kensington, he paused at the door. Yes? I won't forget this. Something about the way she said it made Graham feel like he had received a gift rather than given one. Get some rest, Miss Williams. Tomorrow will be better. As Graham rode back to his penthouse in his private car, he found himself thinking about Zora. There was something about her, a strength, a dignity despite her circumstances, that intrigued him. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Graham Kensington was curious about someone else's story. His phone rang, displaying the name of his vice president. No doubt another crisis that needed his immediate attention, but instead of the familiar sense of purpose, Graham felt a surprising reluctance to dive back into work. For the first time in years, he had done something completely unplanned, completely unlike himself. And strangely, it felt good. Little did he know this impulsive act of kindness would set in motion events that would change his life forever. Because while Graham Kensington had spent a lifetime building walls around his heart, Zora Williams was about to show him that some walls were meant to come down. And as the snow continued to fall over New York City, two lives that should never have intersected had just become unexpectedly entwined. 1 week later, Zora stood at the window of the apartment, watching the morning sun reflect off the melting snow. The past 7 days had felt like a dream. Sleeping in a real bed, taking hot showers, having a safe place to call her own, even temporarily, she turned to look at the small living room. She had kept everything immaculate, afraid that one wrong move might make Graham Kensington regret his generosity. The man was a mystery to her. Why would a billionaire businessman care about a woman he found huddled outside his building? The phone in the kitchen rang, startling her. Only one person had that number. Hello, she answered cautiously. Ms. Williams, it's Graham Kensington. I wanted to check how you're settling in. His deep voice sent an unexpected shiver through her. Everything is fine, Mr. Kensington. Thank you again for your kindness. Have you had any luck with job hunting? Zora sighed. Not yet. I've submitted applications to several care facilities, but nothing so far. There was a pause on the line. Actually, that's partly why I'm calling. My personal assistant mentioned that the company is looking for someone to manage the executive floor kitchen and break room. It's nothing glamorous. Keeping things stocked, making sure everything is clean, occasionally preparing simple meals for meetings. Would you be interested? Zora's heart raced. A job? Yes, I would be very interested. Good. Can you come to the office today around noon? I'll be there, Zora said, trying to keep her voice steady. After hanging up, she rushed to the closet where she had hung her few belongings. Nothing seemed appropriate for a job interview at a prestigious company, like Kensington Enterprises. She settled on her least worn pair of black pants and a simple white blouse. At precisely noon, Zora stood in the lobby of the Kensington building, nervously smoothing her hands over her clothes. The receptionist directed her to the executive floor where she found Graham waiting by the elevator. Ms. Williams, he greeted her with a nod. Thank you for coming on such short notice. Thank you for thinking of me, she replied. Graham led her through a hallway of glass-walled offices to a spacious kitchen area. This is the executive break room. It needs to be stocked daily, cleaned throughout the day, and occasionally you'd prepare coffee and snacks for meetings. Zora looked around at the gleaming countertops and high-end appliances. I can handle that. The hours are 8 to 5, Monday through Friday. The pay is fair. Better than market rate, actually. He named a figure that made Zora's eyes widen slightly. Does that work for you? Yes, that's more than generous, Graham nodded. Good, you can start tomorrow. Zora couldn't believe how easy it had been. Mr. Kensington, I have to ask, why are you doing all this for me? Graham seemed uncomfortable with the question. The position needed to be filled. You needed a job. It's a simple solution to both problems. But Zora sensed there was more to it than that. Still, I want you to know I'm grateful, and I'll work hard to prove I deserve this chance. Something flickered in Graham's eyes. I have no doubt you will, Ms. Williams. As they walked back to the elevator, they passed a striking blonde woman who stopped abruptly at the sight of them. Graham, darling, she air-kissed both his cheeks. I've been looking for you. Victoria, Graham said, his tone noticeably cooler. I didn't know you were coming by today. I wanted to surprise you. Her eyes swept over Zora with barely concealed disdain. And who is this? This is Zora Williams, our new executive floor manager. Zora, this is Victoria Sinclair. Victoria's smile didn't reach her eyes. How interesting. Well, Graham, don't forget about the charity gala this weekend. The Sinclairs and Kensingtons are hosting together as always. I haven't forgotten, Graham replied. After Victoria sauntered off, Zora couldn't help asking, Is she your girlfriend? Graham's expression was unreadable. Victoria's family and mine have been connected for generations. Our parents always hoped we would get together, but no, she's not my girlfriend. Just a persistent friend. Zora nodded, unsure why she felt relieved at his answer. The next morning, Zora arrived early for her first day. She quickly learned the routines of the office and the preferences of the executives. Graham's assistant Diane was particularly helpful, showing her where everything was kept and explaining the office dynamics. Mr. Kensington likes his coffee black, 2 sugars, Diane told her, and he often skips lunch, so if you can leave something simple in his office around 1, he might actually eat it. Does he always work such long hours? Zora asked, remembering how late he had been leaving the night they met. Diane nodded. Always. The man is married to this company. I've worked for him for 5 years, and I don't think he's taken a vacation once. As the days passed, Zora settled into her role. She took pride in keeping the break room spotless and making sure the executives always had what they needed. She noticed Graham rarely came to the break room himself, instead sending Diane for his coffee, but occasionally she would look up to find him watching her from his office. Whenever their eyes met, he would quickly look away, returning to his work. 2 weeks into her job, Zora was staying late to prepare for a board meeting the next morning when Graham emerged from his office. You're here late, he said, looking surprised to see her. I wanted to get everything ready for tomorrow's meeting, she explained. Graham leaned against the doorway, loosening his tie. "You're doing a good job, Zora. Everyone has noticed." The praise warmed her unexpectedly. "Thank you, I appreciate the opportunity." "How's the apartment working out?" "It's perfect. Actually, I was going to talk to you about rent. Now that I have a steady paycheck, I can start paying you." Graham waved his hand dismissively. "There's no rush. Get yourself established first." Zora frowned. "I don't want to take advantage of your kindness, Mr. Kensington." "Graham," he corrected her, "and you're not taking advantage. I own the building. One vacant apartment doesn't affect me. Still, I need to pay my own way. It's important to me." Graham studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I understand. We can work out a fair arrangement." Their conversation was interrupted by a security guard who appeared at the door. "Mr. Kensington, there's someone here to see Ms. Williams. Says it's urgent." Zora couldn't imagine who would be looking for her here. She followed the guard to the lobby, with Graham trailing behind, his curiosity apparently piqued. A tall man, with a hard face, waited by the reception desk. Zora froze when she saw him. "There you are," the man said, his voice slick with false charm. "You're a hard woman to find, Zora." "Marcus," she whispered, fear evident in her voice. "How did you find me?" "I have my ways. We have unfinished business." Graham stepped forward. "Can I help you with something?" Marcus sized Graham up. "This doesn't concern you, Suit. Zora and I go way back, don't we, baby?" Zora's hands were trembling. "There's nothing to discuss, Marcus. Please leave." "Not until you give me what's mine." Graham's voice turned cold. "I think the lady asked you to leave," Marcus sneered. "And who do you think you are?" "I'm Graham Kensington, and this is my building. You have exactly 5 seconds to exit before security escorts you out." Something in Graham's tone must have registered with Marcus, because his expression changed. "Kensington, the real estate guy?" He looked between Graham and Zora. Well, you've moved up in the world, Zora. Always knew you were a smart girl." "Security," Graham called, and 2 guards appeared instantly. "I'm going," Marcus said, raising his hands. "But this isn't over, Zora. You know what you owe me." After he was gone, Zora stood shaking in the lobby. "Who was that?" Graham asked gently. "My ex," Zora managed to say. "From a long time ago. I'm sorry he came here." "Don't apologize." "Are you all right?" Zora nodded, but she was clearly rattled. "I should go. I'll drive you home," Graham said, not a question but a statement. In his car, Zora sat silently staring out the window. Graham didn't press her for details, but his mind was racing with questions. Who was this Marcus, and what kind of hold did he have over Zora? When they reached the apartment building, Graham walked her to her door. "Thank you for the ride," Zora said, her voice steadier now. "Zora," Graham said, hesitating, "if you're in some kind of trouble—" She shook her head. "It's nothing I can't handle." But Graham wasn't convinced. "If he bothers you again, call me. Anytime." Their eyes met, and for a moment something passed between them, a connection neither had expected to feel. "Why do you care?" Zora asked softly. Graham had been asking himself the same question. Why did this woman matter to him? Why had he gone out of his way to help her when he'd spent his life focused solely on business? "I don't know," he admitted, "but I do." The honesty of his answer surprised them both. Zora's expression softened, and for a brief moment, Graham thought she might reach out to him. Instead, she unlocked her door. "Good night, Graham," she said, his name sounding different when she said it. "Good night, Zora." As Graham drove back to his penthouse, he couldn't shake the image of Zora's face when she saw Marcus. She had been genuinely afraid, and for the first time in his adult life, Graham felt a fierce, protective instinct that had nothing to do with business or profit. It was unsettling, unwelcome, and yet he couldn't deny it was there. Meanwhile, alone in her apartment, Zora leaned against the door, her heart still racing. Marcus finding her complicated everything. And Graham's unexpected protectiveness confused her even more. She had sworn never to rely on anyone again, especially not a man. Her walls had kept her safe for years, but something about Graham Kensington made her wonder if some walls were meant to come down, and that thought terrified her more than Marcus ever could. The charity gala was in full swing at the Plaza Hotel. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the ballroom filled with New York's elite. Graham Kensington adjusted his bow tie as he navigated through the crowd, nodding politely at familiar faces but avoiding lengthy conversations. "There you are!" Victoria Sinclair appeared at his side, stunning in a red designer gown. "I've been looking all over for you." Graham forced a smile. "Victoria, you look lovely." "And you look distracted," she replied, hooking her arm through his. "You've barely said 2 words to anyone all evening. What's on your mind?" What was on his mind was Zora. After the incident with Marcus 3 days ago, she had been quieter at work, her usual warmth dimmed by whatever worry she carried. Graham had tried to give her space, but he couldn't stop thinking about her. "Just business," Graham answered Victoria. "The Hudson Yards project is at a critical stage." Victoria rolled her eyes. "Business, always business. You need to learn to relax, darling." She leaned closer. "Maybe I could help with that." Graham was saved from responding by the arrival of his brother, Charles Kensington. "Graham, there you are," Charles said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Mother's been asking for you." Graham excused himself, grateful for the interruption. Charles fell into step beside him. "So, what's this I hear about a new employee you're taking a special interest in?" Charles asked. Graham shot his brother a sharp look. "What are you talking about?" "Come on, Graham, it's all over the office, the mysterious woman you personally hired, the one you drove home the other night." "You're misinformed," Charles laughed. "Am I? That's not like you, Graham. Usually you barely notice the staff exists. She's a good employee who needed a job, that's all. If you say so." Charles's tone made it clear he didn't believe it. "Just be careful. The board is already nervous about the Hudson Yards investment. They won't like any distractions right now." Graham bristled. "My personal life is not the board's concern. Everything is the board's concern when it affects the company." Charles lowered his voice. "And Victoria's father won't be pleased if you're suddenly interested in someone else. The Sinclair partnership is too important." Before Graham could respond, they reached their mother, Eleanor Kensington, a regal woman in her 70s who still commanded any room she entered. "Graham, there you are." She kissed his cheek. "You've been avoiding the Morgans all evening. Their daughter just graduated from Yale Law. You should talk to her." Graham sighed. His mother's matchmaking was relentless. "Mother, I'm not interested." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Victoria tells me you've been distracted lately. Is there something I should know?" "Nothing that concerns you," Graham replied. "Everything about you concerns me, dear. I'm your mother." She patted his arm. "Now go mingle. The Morgans are major investors." As Graham dutifully made his rounds, shaking hands and making small talk, his mind kept drifting back to Zora. The contrast between her genuine warmth and the plastic smiles surrounding him was stark. At his penthouse later that night, Graham loosened his tie and poured himself a scotch. The city lights twinkled beyond his floor-to-ceiling windows, but the view that had once filled him with pride now seemed empty. On impulse, he picked up his phone. Meanwhile, Zora sat at her small kitchen table, staring at a stack of bills. She had just finished her first week's paycheck calculations. After putting aside enough for rent to Graham and her basic expenses, there wasn't much left, certainly not enough to pay what Marcus was demanding. Her ex-boyfriend had been texting her constantly since their encounter at Kensington Enterprises. Each message was more threatening than the last. "You owe me $5,000 and I want it by the end of the month," his latest message read. "Or I'll tell your new boss exactly what kind of woman he hired." Zora put her head in her hands. Marcus was bluffing. She had nothing to hide. But she couldn't bear the thought of Graham looking at her differently if Marcus started spreading lies. The apartment phone rang, startling her. At this hour it could only be one person. "Hello," she answered cautiously. "Zora, it's Graham. I hope I'm not calling too late." Her heart skipped at the sound of his voice. "No, it's fine. Is everything okay?" "Yes, I just..." He paused. "I wanted to check if Marcus has bothered you again." Zora hesitated. Should she tell him about the texts? No, this was her problem to solve. "I haven't seen him." "Good." Another pause. "How are you doing otherwise?" The concern in his voice nearly undid her. When was the last time anyone had simply asked how she was doing? "I'm fine," she said, the automatic response she always gave. Are you sure? You've seemed different the past few days. That he had noticed touched her deeply. Just tired, I guess. Zora, if you need help with anything... I don't, she cut him off, perhaps too quickly. But thank you for checking on me. After they hung up, Zora stared at the phone, confused by the feelings stirring inside her. Graham Kensington was her boss and her landlord. Getting emotionally involved with him would be a mistake. She'd been down that road before, trusting. A man who seemed kind only to discover his true nature too late. No, she wouldn't make that mistake again. Graham might seem different, but men like him, wealthy, powerful, they always wanted something in return for their kindness. The next morning at work, Zora was arranging a fruit platter for a meeting when Victoria Sinclair walked into the break. "So you're the famous Zora," Victoria said, eyeing her critically. "I've been hearing quite a bit about you." Zora continued her work, refusing to be intimidated. "Is there something I can help you with, Ms. Sinclair?" "Yes, actually, you can help by understanding your place." Victoria's voice was honey-sweet, but her eyes were cold. "Graham has a tendency to take in strays. It's an endearing quality, but don't mistake his charity for anything more." Zora set down the knife she was using. "I'm not sure what you're implying, but my relationship with Mr. Kensington is strictly professional." Victoria laughed. "Of course it is, and it should stay that way. Graham and I have a history and a future that was decided long before you appeared. The Sinclairs and Kensingtons have been allies for generations. Some might even say I'm practically family already." Before Zora could respond, Diane appeared at the door. "Zora, Mr. Kensington would like to see you in his office." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Well, duty calls, remember what I said." Zora took a moment to compose herself before heading to Graham's office. She knocked on the door, and his deep voice called for her to enter. Graham looked up from his desk, his expression brightening when he saw her. "Zora, thank you for coming. Please sit down." She sat across from him, acutely aware of Victoria's warning. "You wanted to see me?" "Yes. I have a proposition for you." He folded his hands on the desk. "Kensington Enterprises is hosting an important client dinner next week at my penthouse. It's a crucial meeting for the Hudson Yards project. I need someone I can trust to oversee the catering and make sure everything runs smoothly." "And you want me to do that?" Graham nodded. "You've proven yourself to be capable and discreet. I'd pay you additionally for the evening, of course." Zora thought of the bills waiting on her table, of Marcus's threats. The extra money would help. "I'd be happy to do it." "Excellent. My driver will pick you up next Thursday at 4 p.m. The dinner starts at 7. As Zora turned to leave, Graham spoke again. "Zora, was Victoria bothering you earlier? I saw her in the break room with you." So he had been watching. "Nothing I couldn't handle." Graham's jaw tightened. "She can be territorial. Don't let her intimidate you." "I don't intimidate easily, Mr. Kensington." A smile tugged at his lips. "No, I don't imagine you do." Their eyes met, and that strange connection flared between them again. Zora quickly looked away. "Will there be anything else?" "No, that's all for now." The week passed quickly, and Thursday arrived before Zora was ready. She had carefully selected her outfit, a simple black dress, professional but elegant. As promised, Graham's driver arrived at 4 p.m. sharp. Zora had never seen such luxury as Graham Kensington's penthouse. The space was immaculate, all steel glass and dark wood, with priceless art on the walls and a view that took her breath away. The caterers were already setting up when she arrived. She introduced herself and immediately took charge, making sure everything was progressing according to schedule. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't notice Graham's arrival until he spoke behind her. "You look right at home." She turned to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I hope that's a good thing," she replied. "It is." He gestured around the apartment. "What do you think?" "It's beautiful," she said honestly, "but it doesn't feel very lived in." Graham looked surprised by her observation. "I suppose it isn't. I'm rarely here except to sleep." The caterers announced they needed to discuss a last-minute menu change, and Zora excused herself to handle it. For the next hour she worked efficiently, making sure everything was perfect. The dinner was a success. Zora remained in the background, ensuring drinks were refilled and courses were served at the right moment. Several times she caught Graham watching her, a thoughtful expression on his face. After the clients left, Zora began supervising the cleanup. "Leave that for tomorrow," Graham said, approaching her with 2 glasses of wine. "Join me for a drink." She hesitated. "I should get back, it's late." "1 drink," he insisted, "to celebrate a successful evening." Against her better judgment, Zora accepted the glass. They moved to the balcony, where the city sprawled beneath them, a tapestry of lights against the night sky. "Thank you for tonight," Graham said. "Everything was perfect. I was just doing my job. You were doing much more than that." He turned to her. "You have a gift for making people feel at ease. I've never seen Mr. Tanaka laugh so much at one of these dinners." Zora smiled. "He reminds me of my grandfather, same dry sense of humor." "Tell me about your family," Graham said. The request caught her off guard. "There's not much to tell. My parents died when I was young. My grandmother raised me until she passed when I was 17. After that, I was on my own." "That explains a lot," Graham said softly. "What do you mean?" "Your resilience, your independence." He paused. "The way you hold everyone at a distance." Zora stiffened. "You don't know me, Graham." "I'd like to." The simple admission hung in the air between them. Before she could respond, his phone rang. He checked the screen and frowned. "I need to take this. Excuse me for a moment." Alone on the balcony, Zora tried to calm her racing heart. This was dangerous territory. Graham Kensington was not just her boss, he was from a different world entirely. A world where people like Victoria Sinclair belonged, not people like her. When Graham returned, his expression was grave. "I'm sorry, but something's come up. I need to take care of it right away." "Of course, I'll go." "No, it's not that." He ran a hand through his hair, something she'd never seen him do before. "It's about you, actually. My security team just called. Marcus was seen outside your apartment building earlier today." Zora felt the blood drain from her face. "What?" "He was talking to the doorman, asking questions about you. When the doorman wouldn't give him information, he became belligerent. Security removed him. But I'm concerned about you going back there tonight." "I'll be fine," Zora insisted, though fear curled in her stomach. Graham shook his head. "I don't think you should stay there tonight. I have a guest room here. Or I can put you up in a hotel if you'd prefer." "I can't impose." "It's not an imposition, Zora." His voice was firm. "It's about your safety." She wanted to refuse, to prove she could handle this on her own. But the thought of facing Marcus tonight terrified her. "The guest room," she said finally. "Just for tonight." Graham nodded. "I'll have my driver bring some things from your apartment. Is there a spare key?" "In the kitchen drawer." While they waited for the driver to return, Graham showed her to the guest room, a space larger than her entire apartment, with its own bathroom and a view just as spectacular as the living rooms. "Why are you doing all this?" Zora asked, the question that had been haunting her since the night they met. Graham was quiet for a long moment. "Because when I look at you, I see someone who's been fighting alone for too long, someone who deserves better." He took a step closer. "And because when I'm with you, I feel something I haven't felt in years." "What's that?" she whispered. "Alive." The intensity in his eyes made her heart race. He was close enough now that she could feel the warmth of his body, smell his expensive cologne. For a wild moment she thought he might kiss her, and worse, she wanted him to. A knock at the door broke the spell. The driver had returned with her things. "You should get some rest," Graham said, stepping back. "We can talk more in the morning." Alone. In the guest room, Zora sat on the edge of the bed, her emotions in turmoil. What was happening between them was impossible. He was Graham Kensington, billionaire, empire builder. She was a woman who had been homeless just weeks ago. They came from different worlds, and yet when he looked at her, none of that seemed to matter. As she drifted off to sleep in the softest bed she'd ever felt, Zora couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully constructed walls were beginning to crumble, and for the first time in years, the thought didn't terrify her. Morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the guest room, gently waking Zora. For a moment, she was disoriented. Then she remembered she was in Graham's penthouse. The events of the previous night came rushing back. The dinner, their conversation on the balcony, Marcus lurking around her apartment. She got up and showered in the luxurious bathroom, then dressed in the clothes the driver had brought. When she emerged from the guest room, she found Graham in the kitchen making coffee. The sight of New York's most powerful businessman in casual clothes, his hair slightly rumpled, made her pause. "Good morning," Graham said, looking up with a smile that made her heart flutter. "Coffee? Please." He handed her a mug, their fingers brushing briefly. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I expected," she admitted. They sat at the breakfast bar, a comfortable silence between them as they sipped their coffee. It felt strangely domestic, almost as if they'd been doing this for years. "Zora," Graham finally said, "we need to talk about Marcus. What does he want from you?" She stared into her coffee. "Money. He claims I owe him $5,000 from when we were together." "Do you?" Zora looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "No. But Marcus has a way of twisting things, making people believe his version of events." "Tell me about him," Graham said gently. She sighed. "We were together for almost a year, 3 years ago. He was charming at first, said all the right things. I was lonely after my grandmother died, and he made me feel less alone." She paused, but then he changed. He lost his job and started gambling. He'd come home drunk, angry. When I tried to leave, he threatened me, said no one else would ever want me. Graham's expression darkened. "Did he hurt you?" "Not physically, but emotionally." She swallowed hard. "I finally left when I found out he'd been stealing money from my bank account. I moved, changed my number. I thought I was free of him until he showed up at your office." $5,000 isn't much," Graham said. "I could—" "No," Zora interrupted firmly. "I won't take your money for this, and even if I paid him, he'd just keep coming back for more. Marcus never stops." Graham reached across the counter and took her hand. His touch was warm, steady. "You're not alone in this anymore, Zora." The way he looked at her, with such certainty and care, made her throat tight with emotion. For a moment she allowed herself to believe him. The moment was broken by Graham's phone ringing. He glanced at it and frowned. "It's my brother. I need to take this." While Graham took the call in his office, Zora wandered to the living room windows, gazing out at the city below. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. She was drawn to Graham in a way she couldn't explain, and terrified by it at the same time. Graham returned, his expression troubled. "That was Charles. There's an emergency board meeting this afternoon. Apparently there are some concerns about the Hudson Yards project." "I should go," Zora said. "You have work to do, and I need to get home anyway." "I don't think that's safe." "Yet," Graham countered. "Let me have security check your apartment first. In the meantime, you can stay here. I'll be at the office most of the day." Zora wanted to argue, but saw the determination in his eyes. "All right, but just until they confirm everything's clear." Graham's driver took him to the office while Zora remained at the penthouse. She felt strangely out of place in the vast, empty space. To keep busy, she straightened the kitchen and helped the caterers who arrived to clean up from the previous night's dinner. Around noon, her cell phone rang, an unknown number. Hesitantly, she answered. "Hello, Zora." Marcus's voice sent a chill through her. "Surprised to hear from me." "How did you get this number?" she demanded. "I have my ways, but that's not important. What's important is that you're running out of time. I want my money." Zora's hands were shaking. "I don't owe you anything." "That's not how I remember it. And I wonder what your fancy new boss would think if he knew the truth about you." "There's nothing to tell," Marcus laughed. "No? What about the fact that you were living with me when that old lady you were taking care of died? What about all the cash and jewelry that went missing from her house?" "That's a lie and you know it. I never took anything." "It's your word against mine, and I can be very convincing, Zora. 5,000 by the end of the week. Or I start talking. Maybe I'll even pay a visit to the police." The line went dead. Zora sank onto a stool, her legs weak. Marcus was bluffing, she knew that. She had never stolen from Mrs. Abernathy or anyone else. But the thought of such accusations being made, of Graham possibly believing them, her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Looking through the peephole, she was surprised to see Victoria Sinclair. Zora opened the door cautiously. "Ms. Sinclair, Graham isn't here." Victoria swept past her into the apartment. "I know, that's why I came now." She looked Zora up and down. My. "Already moved in, have you? That was quick." "I'm not living here," Zora said firmly. "I just stayed in the guest room last night." Victoria strolled around the living room, running her hand over the furniture. "You know, I've always found Graham's taste to be impeccable, in everything except women, apparently." Zora didn't take the bait. "Why are you here?" Victoria turned to face her, all pretense of pleasantry gone. "To give you one last warning. Whatever game you're playing with Graham, the damsel in distress, the hard-working girl from the wrong side of the tracks, it ends now. There's no game. Graham is my employer, my landlord. Please, I've seen the way he looks at you, and I'm not the only one who's noticed." Victoria's voice was cold. "The Kensington family has a legacy to protect. Graham has responsibilities that go beyond whatever attraction he might feel for someone like you." Zora lifted her chin. "Someone like me, a nobody, with nothing to offer except a sad story." Victoria stepped closer. "Did you know Graham and I have been expected to marry since we were children? Our families have been planning it for years. The merger of the Sinclair Media Group and Kensington Enterprises would create the most powerful corporate alliance in New York. That's between you and Graham. It's more than that. It's business, it's family, it's tradition." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "And I won't let some charity case ruin it. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to distance yourself from Graham, find another job, move out of his apartment building, disappear from his life." "Or what?" Victoria smiled coldly. "Or I'll make sure everyone knows about your past. Your ex-boyfriend Marcus has been quite informative. Stealing from an elderly patient? Tsk, tsk." Zora felt the blood drain from her face. "That's a lie. Truth lies, it doesn't matter. What matters is perception. And once the board hears about Graham's involvement with a suspected thief, the damage will be done." Victoria walked to the door. "You have until the end of the week to make your decision. For Graham's sake, I hope you make the right one." After Victoria left, Zora sat frozen, her mind racing. How did Victoria know about Marcus? Were they working together, or had Victoria sought him out after seeing them at the office? Either way, the threat was clear. Zora's presence in Graham's life could hurt him, his reputation, his business, his family standing. And despite everything, the last thing she wanted was to cause him harm. When Graham returned that evening, his expression was grim. "Bad day?" Zora asked as he loosened his tie. "The board is nervous. Some of our investors are threatening to pull out of the Hudson Yards project." He poured himself a scotch. "But that's not your problem. Has security checked your apartment?" "Yes. They said it's clear. No sign of Marcus." Graham nodded. "Good. Still, I'd feel better if you stayed here a few more days, just to be safe." "I can't do that, Graham." Her voice was soft but firm. He looked at her in surprise. "Why not?" "Because..." She hesitated. "Because this isn't right. You're my boss. I'm your employee. People are already talking. Let them talk." "It's not that simple." Zora took a deep breath. "Victoria came by today." Graham's expression darkened. "What did she want?" "To remind me of my place. To tell me about your family's expectations." Zora met his gaze. "She also mentioned Marcus. Somehow she knows about him, about the lies he's telling." Graham set down his glass. "Victoria has no right to interfere in my life. But she's right about one thing. I don't belong in your world, Graham. I never will." He crossed the room to stand in front of her. "That's not true." "It is. Look at all this." She gestured around the penthouse. "This is your reality. Mine is a small apartment and a job that barely pays the bills. We're from different worlds. I don't care about that." His voice was intense. "Zora, since the night I met you, something has changed in me. For years I've been going through the motions, building the company, making money, living up to my family's expectations. But it was all empty. I didn't realize how empty until I met you." His words made her heart ache. "Graham, no, Let me finish. He took her hands in his. You see me. Not the billionaire, not the Kensington name. Just me. Do you know how rare that is? How precious? Tears stung her eyes. Victoria said you two are expected to marry, that your families have been planning it for years. Graham shook his head. Victoria and I grew up together. Our families are close. But there's never been anything between us, at least not on my part. And I've never agreed to any arranged marriage. But your family, my family doesn't control my life, Zora. I'm a grown man who can make his own choices. His eyes searched hers. And I choose you. The simplicity of his declaration took her breath away, but still she hesitated. What about Marcus? The things he's saying about me? I don't believe them for a second. Graham's voice was firm. But if it would make you feel better, we can face him together. Get him to admit he's lying on record. How? I have an idea, but you have to trust me. The next day, Graham's plan was set in motion. Zora sent Marcus a text, agreeing to meet him at a cafe to discuss the money he claimed she owed. What Marcus didn't know was that Graham would be watching from nearby and that the cafe was owned by a friend of his who had agreed to place microphones at their table. When Marcus arrived, Zora was already seated, her heart pounding. She had worn a wire connected to a recording device in her purse. I knew you'd come around, Marcus said, sliding into the seat across from her. You always were smarter than you looked. I want to be clear about something, Marcus, Zora said, her voice steady despite her nerves. I don't owe you any money. I never stole anything from Mrs. Abernathy. You're the one who took her jewelry. Marcus smirked. Prove it. It's your word against mine. And who's going to believe a nobody like you over me? Why are you doing this? We've been apart for years. I saw you going into that fancy building with your rich boss. I know an opportunity when I see one. He leaned forward. 5,000 is nothing to a guy like Kensington. Get it from him, and this all goes away. And if I don't, then I'll make sure. Everyone knows what kind of person you really are, including your boyfriend. Zora's eyes flashed. Marcus, listen carefully. I'm recording this conversation. You just admitted to blackmailing me and implied that you were the one who stole from Mrs. Abernathy, not me. Marcus's face contorted with rage. You bitch! I'd think carefully before you do anything. Graham's voice came from behind him. This entire conversation has been recorded, and there are witnesses. Marcus turned to find Graham standing there, along with a uniformed police officer. Mr. Lopez, the officer said, we'd like you to come down to the station to answer some questions about theft and blackmail. As the officer led a protesting Marcus away, Zora felt a weight lift from her shoulders. It was over. The lies, the fear, all of it. Graham sat down across from her. Are you okay? She nodded, still processing what had just happened. Thank you for believing in me, for helping me. Always, he said simply, reaching across the table to take her hand. 1 month later, Zora stood in the break room at Kensington Enterprises, arranging a fruit platter for a board meeting. So much had changed since that night Graham had found her sheltering from the storm. Marcus had been charged with blackmail and was being investigated for the theft from Mrs. Abernathy's home. Victoria had backed off after Graham had a long private conversation with her father about the future of their company's partnership, and Zora had moved back to her apartment. But she didn't spend much time there anymore. Most nights found her at Graham's penthouse, which no longer felt cold and unlived in. She had added small touches, colorful throw pillows, fresh flowers, books stacked on side tables. More importantly, there was laughter in those rooms now, and warmth, and love. There you are, Graham said, appearing in the doorway. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, as always, but his face was different now, more relaxed, happier. The meeting's about to start. I'll bring the refreshments in a minute, she replied. Graham smiled, that special smile that was just for her. Actually, I was hoping you'd join us. Zora looked up in surprise. Join the board meeting? Why? Because I have a proposition for you. He came closer, taking her hand. I'm starting a foundation, the Kensington Foundation for Housing Security. It will help people who are facing homelessness, provide emergency housing, job training, legal assistance. All the things that might have helped you if they'd been available. Zora felt her eyes fill with tears. Graham, that's wonderful. I want you to run it. His eyes were serious now. You understand what these people are going through better than anyone. You have the heart, the compassion, and the strength to make a real difference. Me? But I don't have the experience. You have what matters most. The rest you can learn. He squeezed her hand. Say yes. Zora thought about how far she had come, from huddling in a doorway in a snowstorm to this moment, all because one man had stopped to see her when everyone else walked by. Yes, she said, her heart full. Graham's face lit up. Then let's go. Tell the board they're about to meet the new executive director of the Kensington Foundation. As they walked toward the boardroom, hand in hand, Zora marveled at the journey that had brought them here. She had been so cold that night, so lost. And Graham had been so empty, so alone despite his wealth and power. They had saved each other. That evening, standing on the balcony of the penthouse they now shared, Zora rested her head on Graham's shoulder as they watched the sun set over the city. What are you thinking? He asked, his arm wrapped around her waist. That I'm glad I was sheltering in your doorway that night. That I'm glad you stopped. Graham turned to her, his eyes reflecting the golden light of sunset. I think I've been waiting for you my whole life. I just didn't know it until I found you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Zora's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a stunning diamond ring. Zora Williams, he said, his voice filled with emotion. You came into my life unexpectedly and changed everything. You showed me what it means to truly care for someone, to put their needs above my own. You taught me that real strength isn't found in power or wealth, but in the courage to open your heart. He took the ring from the box. I know it hasn't been very long, but I've never been more certain of anything. I want to share my life with you, not because I need to take care of you, but because we're stronger together. Will you marry me? Tears of joy slipped down Zora's cheeks. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Graham. As he slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into his arms, Zora felt a sense of peace she had never known before. She had spent so long fighting, surviving, protecting herself from hurt. Now, sheltered in the heart of the man she loved, she was finally home. From his office window across town, Charles Kensington looked at the photograph his investigator had just handed him, Graham proposing to Zora on the penthouse balcony. His expression was unreadable as he set it down on his desk. What do you want me to do with this information? Sir? The investigator asked. Charles was silent for a long moment, thinking of his brother's face in the photo, happier than he had seen him in years, perhaps ever. Nothing, he finally said. Do nothing. Some battles weren't worth fighting, and perhaps, just perhaps, his little brother had found something more valuable than the Kensington legacy. He had found love. The end.